On the morning of September 9, 1739, the stillness of South Carolina's countryside was shattered by the sound of drums, shouts, and gunfire. Near the Stono River, a group of enslaved Africans made a daring decision that would echo through history. This was not merely an outburst of violence, it was an organized attempt at liberation, a cry for freedom in a world that denied them humanity. Known today as the Stono Rebellion, it stands as one of the largest and most significant uprisings of enslaved people in colonial America. Imagine the courage it took to rise up in a society where the odds were overwhelmingly stacked against them. These were men and women who endured endless days of back-breaking labor in the rice fields, watched closely under the harsh eyes of overseers, and lived with the constant reminder that their lives were controlled by others. Yet, even in those dark conditions, the human spirit longed for freedom. On that September morning, that longing erupted into action. Led by an enslaved man named Jemmy, believed to be of Angolan origin, around 20 men stormed a firearms store, killed the guards, and armed themselves with muskets. Beating drums and raising their voices, they set off on a march southward, their goal clear: to reach Spanish Florida. Florida had become a beacon of hope, promising freedom to anyone who could escape the British colonies and pledge allegiance to Spain. Along the way, Jemmy and his followers urged other enslaved people to join, their numbers swelling as they moved forward. For the planters and colonists of South Carolina, the sight of armed enslaved men marching in unison was terrifying. Plantations burned in their wake, and the cries for liberty filled the air. The rebels were not only fighting for themselves, they were declaring that the system of bondage could never fully extinguish the desire for independence. Though their rebellion would ultimately be crushed, its impact was undeniable. The Stono Rebellion remains a vital story in the history of the struggle for freedom in America. It forces us to confront the brutal realities of the past while recognizing the resilience of those who dared to resist oppression. These men and women left behind more than a moment of defiance. They left a legacy of courage, one that continues to inspire conversations about justice, resistance, and the human will to be free. If you find stories like this one powerful and thought-provoking, make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with others who are passionate about uncovering hidden chapters of history. Together, we can keep these stories alive and ensure that the voices of the past are never forgotten. It was the largest slave uprising in the British mainland colonies before the American Revolution. And to understand the scale of this moment, we must step back into the world of 18th century South Carolina. The colony was not only a place of expanding plantations and wealth for European settlers, but also a society built almost entirely on the forced labor of Africans. Rice cultivation was backbreaking, grueling work, and the humid low-country climate was unforgiving. Enslaved men and women worked from dawn until dusk in flooded fields, constantly exposed to disease and exhaustion, all while under the harsh control of overseers. For the planters, profits grew, but for the enslaved community, daily life was a relentless battle for survival. In such conditions, the idea of escape was never far from their minds. But for many, escape alone was not enough. Florida, controlled by Spain, offered the tantalizing promise of freedom. The Spanish crown had made an extraordinary offer. Enslaved people who could reach Florida would not only be granted liberty, but also land and protection, provided they converted to Catholicism. News of this spread like wildfire across the enslaved population of South Carolina, carried in whispers and secret conversations. Florida became more than a destination. It became a symbol of hope, a place where freedom was not just a dream but a real possibility. Against this backdrop, the Stono Rebellion erupted. On that September morning in 1739, when Jemmy and his companions seized weapons and marched south, they were not acting spontaneously. They were enacting a vision, a desperate yet determined attempt to break the chains that bound them. Their rebellion was not small, nor was it hidden. It was visible. and defiant. They marched with drums, raising their voices so that others might hear, so that the enslaved across the countryside might join them. In this way, the Stono rebels were not only fighting for their own lives but calling an entire community to rise with them. As the group moved forward, the uprising grew larger and more dangerous in the eyes of the colonists. Plantations burned, colonists were killed, and fear swept through the region. The rebellion disrupted the illusion of control that the planters believed they held. For years, they had assumed that the system of bondage was secure, that fear and punishment would keep people subdued. But the Stono Rebellion exposed a truth they could not ignore. Beneath the surface, resistance had always been present, waiting for its moment. The scale of the uprising shocked the British colonies. Nothing like it had been seen before, and it would not be forgotten afterward. The confrontation that followed was brutal. Colonial militia quickly mobilized, and armed clashes erupted. The rebels fought valiantly, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. Many were killed in the fighting. Others captured, and those captured were executed in gruesome public displays, meant to serve as warnings to the rest of the enslaved population. Yet even in defeat, the message of the rebellion could not be silenced. It lingered in the air, in the whispered stories of survivors, and in the fearful policies of colonial leaders. The magnitude of the Stono Rebellion forced the British authorities to reconsider how they controlled their enslaved population. The result was the Negro Act of 1740, a sweeping law that aimed to strip away any possibility of resistance. Enslaved people were forbidden from assembling in large groups, from learning to read, from growing their own food, or from earning money independently. These laws sought to suffocate any future uprising, but their very existence revealed how deeply shaken the colony had been. Leaders understood that the Stono Rebellion was not a random event. It was the eruption of long-simmering resentment and the undeniable human yearning for liberty. Looking back, what makes the Stono Rebellion so significant is not just the violence of the moment but the meaning behind it. These were men and women who had been uprooted from Africa, many of whom carried with them memories of warfare, of resistance, and of community. Jemmy and others were believed to have military experience, and that knowledge gave structure to their rebellion. They were not powerless victims, but active participants in shaping their destiny. However dangerous the outcome might be, their actions demonstrated that even in the harshest conditions, the desire for freedom could not be extinguished. When we call it the largest slave uprising in the British mainland colonies before the American Revolution, we are recognizing its scale, but also its legacy. It was a foreshadowing of the struggles that would define the American experience. The tension between freedom and bondage, between authority and resistance, between human dignity and exploitation. The colonists themselves, just decades later, would rise against British rule in the name of liberty. Yet the Stono rebels had already risked everything for that same principle. Their story reveals the contradictions at the heart of colonial America, where the language of freedom was spoken in one breath, while the practice of slavery was enforced with the next. The Stono Rebellion deserves to be remembered not as a failed attempt, but as a testament to human courage. It tells us that resistance has many forms, and that even when crushed, it leaves a mark on history. The legacy of those who marched on that September morning lives on in the broader narrative of freedom's struggle. Their bravery shaped the fears of the powerful, the laws of the colonies, and the memory of generations who would continue to fight against injustice. To study the Stono Rebellion is to see not only the pain of the past but also the enduring flame of resistance that could never be extinguished. The leader was an enslaved man named Jemmy, believed to be of Angolan origin, and in many ways his story gives the rebellion its beating heart. Though the details of his early life remain hidden in the shadows of history, fragments suggest he had once lived a life very different from the bondage he endured in South Carolina. Angola, at the time, was a region deeply entangled with European powers. a place where war and enslavement were constant realities, yet also a place where many Africans gained military experience. It is possible, even likely, that Jemmy had been trained in organized combat before being forced across the Atlantic. If this is true, then his leadership of the Stono Rebellion was not a coincidence. It was the continuation of knowledge, skill, and defiance that had traveled with him from Africa to America. When we imagine Jemmy, we see not only an enslaved man on a plantation, but a figure who carried within him the memory of freedom. To be enslaved did not erase the culture, languages, or traditions that men like him brought with them. Across the rice fields of South Carolina, Africans preserved fragments of their heritage, songs and rhythms, words and gestures that reminded them of who they had once been. Jemmy, like many others, likely clung to these remnants as a source of strength. It is within this cultural memory that we can understand how the rebellion was more than an act of desperation. It was a deliberate expression of identity and a refusal to accept a life of perpetual servitude. The morning of September 9th, 1739, was the culmination of that inner fire. Jemmy and about 20 followers seized weapons from a store, and from that moment the rebellion was no longer just a dream whispered under the stars but a living reality. He is said to have raised a banner and led his men with drums, the beat echoing through the fields, calling others to join. This detail is powerful because it reminds us that the rebellion was not hidden in secrecy but declared openly. Jemmy wanted the sound to carry, to spread the message of defiance, to show that resistance was possible. He was not leading a quiet escape but a public demonstration of courage that challenged the very order of colonial life. As they marched southward towards Spanish Florida, Jemmy's role as a leader became even more significant. Florida symbolized a chance at freedom, and the promise made by the Spanish crown offered legitimacy to their actions. This was not a random outburst of violence, it was a calculated attempt to reach a destination where liberty was guaranteed. Along the way, more enslaved people joined, drawn by the hope that Jemmy represented. His presence gave shape to their movement, and the sight of a determined leader carrying the fight forward must have inspired others who had long endured the silence of despair. Yet leadership in such a moment was fraught with danger. Jemmy had to guide not only the physical march but also the fragile unity of men and women risking everything. Each step southward meant the possibility of ambush, the certainty of pursuit, and the knowledge that failure could mean death. Still, Jemmy pressed on, his authority rooted not in imposed power but in the trust of those who followed him. This trust was built on shared suffering, on the common yearning for freedom, and on the unspoken belief that if anyone could lead them to safety, it was him. The colonists, terrified by the scale of the uprising, quickly organized militias to intercept the rebels. The confrontation that followed was violent and decisive. Jemmy and many of his followers fought bravely but were overwhelmed. Accounts suggest that he may have fallen in battle, though the exact details of his death remain unclear. What is certain is that his leadership ended that day, but the rebellion he ignited did not vanish with him. Instead, it lived on in memory, shaping the laws that were passed in its aftermath and inspiring future generations to question the injustices they endured. In remembering Jemmy, we must see more than just the tragic end. We must recognize the courage it took to rise, the vision required to attempt something so audacious, and the skill needed to organize men into a force that shook the foundations of the colony. Jemmy represents the intersection of two worlds: the African heritage that gave him strength and the American reality that demanded resistance. His story reminds us that enslaved people were not passive victims but active participants in shaping their destiny. Even when faced with overwhelming odds, the legacy of Jemmy extends beyond the Stono Rebellion itself. His defiance became part of the larger narrative of freedom in America, a narrative that would eventually culminate in revolutions, in abolitionist movements, and in the ongoing struggle for justice. Though his name is not as widely known as the figures who shaped political revolutions, His role in this rebellion places him among the earliest leaders to challenge the contradictions of a society that spoke of liberty while perpetuating bondage. As we reflect on his story, we see that Jemmy's life embodies the resilience of the human spirit. His rebellion was crushed, yet his courage revealed a truth that could not be silenced, that the desire for freedom is universal, and that even in the harshest conditions, people will rise to claim it. The story of Jemmy and the Stono Rebellion remains a testament to that enduring truth, a reminder that leadership is not always measured by victory, but sometimes by the willingness to act when action seems impossible. His name, carried through time, continues to stand as a symbol of defiance, determination, and the unbreakable pursuit of freedom. Around 20 enslaved men gathered in the stillness of the early morning, their breath steady, their hearts filled with a mixture of fear and determination. And under Jemmy's guidance, they approached the small firearms store that would become the starting point of their defiance. For years they had labored under the crushing weight of bondage, their bodies pushed to exhaustion in the rice fields, their identities reduced to property, their dreams hemmed in by chains. Yet in that moment, the memory of who they had been, men of strength, culture, and in some cases military experience, returned in full force. The store was not just a building filled with weapons. It was the gateway to possibility, the threshold between silence and action, between submission and freedom. When the door was forced open and the shopkeepers confronted them, the confrontation was swift and bloody. The rebels did not hesitate, for hesitation meant failure, and failure meant certain death. In this, the shopkeepers were struck down, and the weapons that had been symbols of colonial control now changed hands. Muskets, powder, and ammunition were seized, tools that transformed Jemmy Spand from a group of desperate men into an armed force capable of defying their oppressors. The sound of the first shots echoed through the morning air, announcing to the countryside that something extraordinary had begun. Arming themselves was more than a practical necessity. It was a statement. These were men who had long been denied the right to bear arms, denied the right to defend themselves. And in this act they reclaimed a power that had been systematically stripped from them. With every musket they carried, and every round of ammunition they loaded, they were rewriting the rules imposed upon them. The act of seizing weapons was symbolic of seizing agency over their own lives. It was a bold proclamation that they would no longer exist as silent laborers under the watchful eyes of overseers, but as fighters determined to carve out a path to liberty. As they marched away from the store, the rebellion took on a new life. The weapons in their hands emboldened them, and their confidence grew. Drums sounded. Voices rose, and the once quiet road southward became a corridor of resistance. They were no longer isolated individuals but a collective force united by purpose, and the sound of their approach carried across the fields, reaching the ears of those who had long harbored secret hopes of freedom. The rebels knew the risks, they knew militias would soon come for them, that their time was limited, but in that moment of power, they also knew that fear could no longer dictate their existence. The significance of the raid cannot be overstated. In colonial society, weapons represented control, authority, and the power to enforce order. By seizing them, the rebels directly challenged the foundation of the system that oppressed them. They disrupted the balance of power, if only for a fleeting moment, and in doing so reminded everyone enslaved and free alike that the system was not invincible. The colonists would have viewed the raid with horror, realizing that the tools they had relied on to maintain dominance could now be turned against them. For the rebels, however, each musket carried not only powder and shot but also the weight of possibility. The chance that they might reach Florida and transform their lives forever. Jemmy's leadership was crucial during this stage. He directed the men with discipline, using his knowledge, perhaps shaped by past experience in Africa, to organize their actions. The decision to strike the firearms store first was not random, it was tactical. Without weapons, their rebellion would have been little more than a desperate flight, easily crushed by colonial patrols. With weapons, they could fight, defend themselves, and inspire others to join. Jemmy understood that to spark a true rebellion, they needed to demonstrate strength, and nothing embodied that more than carrying muskets openly as they marched. The aftermath of the raid spread quickly across the colony. Plantations nearby felt the tremors of danger, and fear gripped the white population, who had long lived with the uneasy awareness that enslaved people outnumbered them. For the rebels, however, the raid was a turning point. The fire was lit, and there was no going back. Each step away from the store carried them deeper into rebellion, deeper into danger, and deeper into history. As they continued south, the armed band became a symbol of defiance. Others who saw them heard the beat of the drum and the call of voices and recognized that something unprecedented was unfolding. Some chose to join, swelling the numbers, while others hesitated, torn between hope and fear. The weapons they carried made all the difference, for they transformed the dream of freedom into a tangible reality. This was not a whispered fantasy in the dark of night, but a rebellion marching in broad daylight. Rifles on shoulders, banners raised, daring the colony to stop them. The raid on the firearms store marked the threshold between years of silent suffering and a moment of open resistance. It was the spark that ignited the rebellion, the act that gave form and weight to a vision of freedom. Though the rebellion would ultimately be crushed, the memory of those men forcing open the door, seizing the weapons, and stepping out as armed rebels endured long after the smoke cleared. The story of Stono is remembered not only because it was the largest uprising of its kind before the American Revolution, but because it embodied the courage of ordinary men who risked everything to reclaim the dignity denied to them. In their hands, the muskets became more than weapons, they became symbols of hope, defiance, and the unyielding human will to be free. The rebels marched south towards Spanish Florida, where freedom was promised to escaped slaves. And in their footsteps lay not just a path of resistance, but also a fragile hope that liberty could be found if they could only endure the journey. Florida had become a beacon of light in a world of darkness, a distant place where the Spanish crown had declared that anyone fleeing the British colonies who reached its soil and pledged allegiance to Spain would be granted freedom. For men who had spent their lives confined to plantations, working in the sweltering sun under the gaze of overseers, this promise was not just a rumor but a call to action. Each step southward brought them closer to a new reality, and it gave meaning to the risks they had taken when they first stormed the firearms store and raised their voices in defiance. The decision to march openly rather than scatter into the woods was bold, even audacious. Jemmy, their leader, understood that secrecy might have allowed a few individuals to escape, but secrecy would never inspire an uprising. By marching with drums, muskets, and banners, the rebels declared their presence to the world. They wanted others to see them, to hear the sounds of freedom carried by the beat of drums across the fields, to know that resistance was possible and that liberation was not a fantasy, but a goal they were actively pursuing. With each plantation they passed, they called out to others in bondage, urging them to join. Some did, swelling their ranks, drawn not only by the weapons but also by the hope that Jemmy's march symbolized. The southward journey was as much psychological as it was physical. The rebels were not merely moving across the land. They were moving toward a dream, carrying within them the vision of a new life. The promise of Spanish Florida stood as a powerful contrast to the world they had left behind. In South Carolina, they were bound by laws that denied them even the smallest freedoms. Forbidden to learn to read, forbidden to gather, forbidden to control their own lives. In Florida, according to the Spanish decree, they would be recognized as free people. given land, and allowed to live with dignity. The very thought of this transformation must have been electrifying, fueling their determination even as danger loomed all around them. But the march was also a race against time. News of the rebellion spread quickly, and the colonial militia mobilized to intercept them. Jemmy and his followers knew that the longer they remained on the move, the greater the risk of being surrounded. Yet they pressed forward, driven by the idea that freedom was worth every risk. As they marched, they left behind scenes that shook the colony to its core: burned plantations, fallen colonists, and the undeniable reality that the enslaved population was neither silent nor powerless. The colonists saw in the rebels' journey not only a threat to their immediate safety, but also a challenge to the entire system upon which their society was built. For the rebels, however, the march was about more than destruction. It was about visibility, about forcing the world to see them as men and women who longed for liberty. They could have tried to hide in swamps or woods, relying on secrecy to evade capture, but such a strategy would have been solitary, leaving the larger enslaved population untouched. Jemmy's choice to march openly toward Florida transformed the rebellion into something larger than an escape attempt. It became a movement, however brief, that carried with it the aspirations of countless others who could not join. In their footsteps, they carried not just their own hopes, but the hopes of an entire community that dreamed of a life beyond chains. The image of the rebels moving south with muskets on their shoulders, drums beating in rhythm, and voices raised in chants must have been unforgettable for those who witnessed it. For enslaved people who watched from the fields as the group passed, the sight was both exhilarating and dangerous. Joining meant risking everything, but staying behind meant remaining in bondage. For the colonists who saw the rebels advancing, the image was terrifying, a vision of the order they had imposed unraveling before their eyes. The march to Florida, therefore, was not just a journey across miles, but a journey into the heart of the colonial system, exposing its fragility and its fears. Though the rebels never reached their destination, the act of marching toward Florida was itself a profound statement. It revealed the interconnectedness of the Atlantic world, where promises made by Spain could ignite action in British colonies, and where the dream of liberty traveled across borders and empires. It highlighted the contradictions of colonial America, where freedom was preached as a virtue but denied to so many, and most importantly, it showed that even in the harshest conditions, the idea of liberty was powerful enough to inspire men to take up arms, to march in the open, and to risk everything for a chance at a new beginning. In the end, colonial militias caught up with the rebels, and the confrontation turned violent. Many were killed, others captured, and only a few may have managed to slip away into the swamps or possibly cross into Florida. Yet even in defeat, the march southward remained etched in memory. It was remembered by the colonists as a warning and by the enslaved community as a testament to courage. The laws that followed, including the harsh restrictions of the Negro Act of 1740, proved how deeply the march had unsettled the colonial authorities. They sought to prevent another rebellion, but in doing so, they acknowledged the power of the one that had already occurred. The march toward Spanish Florida, then, was more than a physical journey. It was a declaration that freedom was worth pursuing, even in the face of overwhelming odds. Jemmy and his companions may not have reached their destination, but their footsteps echoed across history, reminding us that the desire for liberty cannot be silenced by laws or chains. Their story lives on as a powerful symbol of resistance, courage, and the enduring human spirit that refuses to be broken. As the small band of rebels pushed southward, their footsteps echoed with both fear and determination, for each mile carried them closer to Spanish Florida, a place whispered about in the slave quarters as a land where freedom was not only possible but promised. The march itself was more than movement across the landscape of South Carolina. It was the physical manifestation of years of anguish, resentment, and hope bottled up inside the enslaved men and women who had suffered under relentless oppression. At first, the rebellion began with only a handful of determined leaders, but word of their daring spread like wildfire. With each passing settlement, more men and women slipped away from the chains of their captors, drawn by the courage of those who dared to defy the powerful system that had dehumanized them for so long. Soon, what began as a modest group transformed into a force of about 60 to 80 followers, all marching together with a single desperate vision: to seize liberty or perish in the attempt. The rebels were not merely fugitives on the run. They were a collective bound by a shared dream. Along the way, they encountered plantations that had been symbols of their suffering, places where whips cracked and lives were broken. Those very estates became the first targets of their fury. As the march turned violent, armed with stolen weapons, they struck at the heart of the colonial system, killing around 20 to 25 colonists who stood in their path. The plantations, once seen as pillars of wealth and power for the white settlers, were set ablaze. Flames licked the skies, devouring wooden beams, cotton stores, and memories of exploitation. For the rebels, the fires symbolized more than destruction. They were acts of defiance, proclamations that they would no longer live quietly in bondage. Each act of resistance sent shockwaves through the countryside, to the enslaved people still working the fields or confined in cabins. The news of the rebellion carried a dangerous but electrifying message. Freedom was possible if one dared to fight for it. To the colonists, however, the rising rebellion was a nightmare come alive. Proof that the system they had built on the backs of enslaved labor could collapse in the face of determined resistance. The rebels' march southward thus became more than a physical journey. It was a battle for control over the very narrative of power in colonial America. Still, the path to Spanish Florida was long and treacherous, and while the growing band of rebels carried the fire of hope in their hearts, they also carried the weight of exhaustion, fear, and the constant threat of retaliation. Every plantation burned, every colonist killed, brought more attention from colonial authorities, who rallied militias to suppress the uprising. The rebels must have known that the further they marched, the closer they came not only to freedom but also to inevitable confrontation with well-armed forces determined to crush them. Yet even with the looming threat of defeat, they pressed forward. Imagine the scene: 60 to 80 men and women, some barefoot, some carrying crude weapons, others holding muskets and ammunition seized from those they had struck down, all marching under the relentless Carolina sun. They were driven by more than survival. They were fueled by stories passed down about Florida, where the Spanish crown had offered sanctuary to escaped slaves, promising not only liberty but land and the possibility of building new lives far away from the cruelty of their past. For those who had known nothing but bondage, the idea of stepping onto free soil, of no longer living under the lash, was powerful enough to risk everything. The rebellion, however, was not simply an outburst of violence. It was an organized, deliberate attempt to break free from an oppressive system. The killing of colonists and the burning of plantations were part of a broader strategy, a way to weaken the enemy, disrupt their economic base, and send a message that those who had long been silenced could indeed strike back. Every shot fired and every building burned was meant to tear at the very fabric of the colonial order. It was a declaration that human beings could not be reduced to property without resistance. As the rebels pushed onward, their unity became both their strength and their vulnerability. They grew stronger in numbers, drawing courage from one another, but at the same time, the larger they became, the harder it was to move quickly and avoid detection. The smoke from burning plantations rose high into the sky, serving as beacons to militias gathering in nearby towns. The rebels' actions, though bold and symbolic, made it clear that a showdown with colonial forces was inevitable. Yet for a brief, powerful moment, the rebels controlled their destiny. They were no longer simply victims of a system, but active agents challenging it with fire and steel. Their defiance carved itself into history, not only as a violent episode, but as a testament to the lengths human beings will go in pursuit of freedom. The plantations they destroyed represented centuries of injustice, and their march toward Spanish Florida, though ultimately doomed, carried with it a profound message. Freedom was worth more than life itself. The burning fields and shattered plantations left scars that could not be erased easily. For the colonists, they were reminders of the fragility of their control, that the enslaved people they had so brutally dominated could rise up and strike back when pushed too far. For the enslaved, the rebellion became legend, a story of courage and sacrifice that whispered through the generations. Even in defeat, the rebels lit a flame that could not be extinguished, a flame that would flicker in the memories of all who longed for liberation. Thus, the march southward, with its gathering of followers, its burning of plantations, and its violent defiance, became one of the earliest and most powerful acts of resistance in American history. Though the rebels did not reach the sanctuary of Spanish Florida, their courage reshaped the consciousness of both the oppressed and the oppressors. It was not only a physical rebellion but a symbolic one, a reminder that in the darkest moments of bondage, the human spirit could still rise, resist, and demand the dignity it deserved. The march of the rebels was not silent, nor was it carried out in secrecy. Instead, it was infused with a living rhythm that echoed through the Carolina Low Country. The rebels used drums and chants to encourage others to join the uprising, and these sounds carried across the open fields and along the winding riverbanks, blending with the rustle of pine trees and the distant hum of plantation life. To the enslaved men and women working in the fields, the sound of those drums was more than noise. It was a call, a signal of defiance, a language of solidarity that transcended words. In African traditions, drums were not merely instruments of entertainment, they were vessels of communication, sacred messengers capable of summoning entire communities into motion. Each beat of the drum carried a meaning. It was an announcement of rebellion, a declaration that something extraordinary was unfolding, and that those who heard it had a choice to make. Would they stay in bondage, or would they rise and march toward the uncertain promise of freedom? The procession of the rebels grew in numbers as the sound of chanting spread from one plantation to the next. The chants themselves were layered with a mixture of urgency and resolve, weaving together fragments of African languages, rhythms, and cadences that had survived the passage across the Atlantic. Though many enslaved Africans had been torn from different regions and spoke different tongues, the beat of the drum was a universal language, one that did not require translation. It tied them back to their homelands, to ceremonies of community and war. And now, in this moment, to the collective dream of liberation. As they marched, the rebels did not hide their intentions. Their voices rose louder, their drums struck harder, and the message was clear. This was not a secretive escape, but an open challenge to the system that had bound them in chains. Plantation owners and colonial officials would later describe these sounds with fear, noting how quickly the rebellion spread, and how difficult it was to contain once the momentum began. The rebels' decision to use drums and chants was both practical and symbolic. Practically, it allowed them to communicate over distances, to signal movement, to draw in potential allies who might be too far to see the march with their own eyes. Symbolically, it reclaimed the cultural tools that had been suppressed under slavery. Slaveholders had long recognized the power of music, particularly drums, and in later decades they would ban enslaved people from using them, fearing exactly the kind of coordination and uprising that was now unfolding. But in 1739, during the Stono Rebellion, the drums rang out freely, unrestrained, daring the colonial system to confront the force of a people united by sound. The soundscape of the rebellion created an atmosphere that was both terrifying and inspiring, depending on which side one stood. For the enslaved communities, It was a sound of hope and courage, proof that someone had found the strength to resist. For the colonists, it was a reminder of how fragile their hold on power truly was, that beneath the surface of enforced silence, there pulsed a deep reservoir of anger and longing for freedom. The rebels' chants carried messages of unity and faith, sometimes invoking religious language that fused African traditions with the Christianity they had been taught in the colonies. Religion, too, became a powerful element of the rebellion, as some rebels saw their cause not only as a struggle for earthly freedom, but also as a divine mission against oppression. As the rebels advanced southward, the rhythm of the drums gave the march a sense of order and purpose. The sound acted as a heartbeat for the movement, keeping them aligned and focused even as chaos erupted around them. Plantations burned in their wake, smoke rising into the sky as a visible marker of defiance. The flames and the drums together created a dramatic spectacle that could not be ignored, a vivid declaration that the enslaved were no longer passive, that they were willing to fight, and that their struggle was now written into the land itself. Each plantation they passed brought new choices. Some enslaved people joined, drawn by the promise of freedom and the courage of the march, while others hesitated, paralyzed by fear of the consequences. Yet even those who did not join were changed by the sound of the drums, by the knowledge that resistance was possible, that others like them were fighting back. The colonial authorities, upon hearing of the rebellion, scrambled to respond, sending militias to intercept the rebels. Yet even before the two forces clashed, the drums had already done their work. They had spread the message of defiance across the region, showing that resistance was not isolated but could spread like wildfire. The Stono Rebellion would ultimately be suppressed, with brutal consequences for those who participated, but its memory lived on precisely because of its power to inspire. The image of rebels marching with drums and chants remained etched in the imagination of both the enslaved and the free, a reminder of how culture and tradition could be transformed into instruments of resistance. The decision to use music as a weapon in the Stono Rebellion reveals the resilience and creativity of the rebels. Stripped of conventional arms, they wielded sound as a tool of war, mobilization, and defiance. The chants gave courage to the fearful, the drums gave rhythm to the march, and together they created a unity that could not be achieved through words alone. Even centuries later, the Stono Rebellion is remembered not only for the violence that marked it, but for the way enslaved Africans turned their cultural heritage into a rallying cry for freedom. The drums may have been silenced by colonial power in the aftermath, but their echoes endured, reverberating across generations as a symbol of resistance and the unyielding human desire for liberty. When the rebels marched southward, their drums still echoing through the Carolina countryside, and their chants urging others to take courage and follow. The sound of their determination carried farther than their footsteps. Word spread quickly, carried by fearful whispers among planters and anxious conversations in nearby settlements. The authorities knew that a group of this size, openly defying the order of the colony, posed a danger that could not be ignored. Before long, the local militia was called to arms. These were men accustomed to maintaining control through force, determined to put down the rebellion before it could grow into something far larger. They moved quickly, intercepting the march near the banks of the Stono River, where the rebels' fiery resolve would soon clash with the cold steel of organized resistance. The encounter was sudden and violent. The rebels, though outnumbered and poorly armed compared to the militiamen, fought with the desperation of those who had tasted a fleeting glimpse of freedom. They wielded farm tools, muskets seized from plantation, and whatever weapons they could gather in their short march. The militia, better equipped and disciplined, advanced with precision, their gunfire cutting through the humid morning air. The chaos of the skirmish was intense. Shouts, smoke, and the pounding of feet filled the landscape. When the dust began to settle, around 20 of the rebels lay dead on the battlefield. Their courage was undeniable, Yet their losses were devastating. Those who survived the clash were hunted relentlessly. Many were captured over the following days, dragged before colonial authorities, and condemned to execution. Public displays of punishment were meant to send a chilling message to anyone who might consider defiance in the future. Bodies were hung or decapitated, their remains placed along roadsides as grim warnings, turning the paths once filled with hopeful chants into corridors of fear. The authorities sought to erase not only the uprising, but also the spirit that had inspired it, stamping out hope by turning it into an example of terror. Yet the memory of the rebellion could not be erased so easily. For the enslaved communities, the story of the Stono rebels spread in whispers and in songs, their bravery remembered even as the price they paid was immense. For the colonial authorities, the uprising was a shock that exposed how fragile their system of control truly was. If a small band of determined people, with little more than faith and courage, could shake the foundations of their order, what might happen if others rose up as well? The fear of this possibility led to sweeping changes in law and society. In the months and years that followed, South Carolina passed what became known as the Negro Act of 1740. This legislation stripped enslaved people of many remaining avenues of autonomy. It forbade them from gathering in large groups, restricted their ability to earn money, banned them from learning to read, and strictly limited their movement. The goal was clear: to prevent communication, to suppress solidarity, and to extinguish the chance of another uprising before it could take root. What had begun as an attempt to control land and labored into an increasingly rigid system, designed to crush the very idea of resistance. For those who lived through it, the memory of the clash was both painful and instructive. To the enslaved, it was proof that freedom was worth fighting for, even against impossible odds. To the colonists, it was a reminder that their control relied not on consent, but on constant surveillance and fear. The Stono Rebellion became a turning point, not because it toppled the system, but because it revealed its deep cracks. Every drumbeat and chant that had called people to join the march continued to resonate in the unspoken defiance of generations to come. The clash by the Stono River was more than a battle. It was a collision between two visions of the world. On one side were men and women who sought the simplest of human rights, the ability to live free, to worship as they wished, to walk without chains. On the other side stood those who defined their power through ownership, determined to maintain a system that reduced human lives to property. The violence of the militia may have silenced the march, but it could not extinguish the hope that had fueled it. Even in defeat, the uprising carried meaning. The rebels' willingness to face death rather than return to bondage revealed a truth that their captors wished to ignore: that the human spirit cannot be contained forever. Though laws became stricter and punishments harsher, the spark of resistance smoldered beneath the surface, waiting for other moments in history to ignite again. In this way, the story of the Stono Rebellion did not end with the militia's victory, but lived on as a testament to courage in the face of overwhelming force. The battle's legacy echoed beyond South Carolina, influencing the way future uprisings and resistance movements were understood. For those who studied the rebellion later, it became a reminder of both the risks of oppression and the resilience of the oppressed. The militia may have claimed victory on the field, but the memory of those who marched with drums and chants, who stood against muskets with little more than resolve, ensured that their fight was not forgotten. The clash, brutal as it was, marked the beginning of a long struggle whose echoes can still be felt when people speak of justice, freedom, and the power of resistance against overwhelming odds. As the dust of battle settled on that September day, the landscape of South Carolina bore silent witness to both the desperation and determination of those who had dared to resist. The clash with the militia had left many lives extinguished, and the echoes of musket fire still lingered in the minds of all who survived. Yet the story did not simply end with defeat. Within its folds remained whispers of escape, rumors that a handful of rebels managed to slip away into the wilderness, continuing their dangerous journey southward towards Spanish Florida. For them, the road ahead was uncertain, filled with treacherous terrain, wild animals, and the constant threat of pursuit. But their hearts held fast to the belief that freedom lay across the border, guarded by Spain's promises of sanctuary. Florida had long represented more than a geographical refuge. It was a beacon, a flickering light of hope where chains might be broken and lives rebuilt beyond the reach of English slaveholders. The Spanish crown, eager to undermine Britain's colonies, had declared that any enslaved Africans who managed to reach their settlements would be granted freedom, land, and protection. For enslaved men and women trapped in the fields of Carolina, this was not just propaganda but a lifeline, and it shaped the very direction of the Stono Rebellion itself. The rebels had not risen blindly or without purpose. Their march southward was deliberate, a carefully chosen path that symbolized both defiance and the will to survive. Still, as history would prove, the vast majority of the rebels never reached this imagined haven. The militia, fueled by fear of further uprisings and determined to send a message of dominance, had swiftly and brutally reasserted control. Dozens of the captured were executed, their deaths staged as warnings to others who might dream of rebellion. The bodies and the stories of those men and women were transformed into instruments of terror, reminders that resistance carried the gravest of costs. Plantation owners across the colony, shaken by the scale and ferocity of the uprising, tightened their grip on the enslaved population, and new laws soon emerged, curtailing movement, gathering, and even cultural expression in an effort to smother any spark of future defiance. And yet, the rumor of escape remained, carried on the wind like a fragile seed. Perhaps it was only a handful, perhaps even fewer, but the possibility that some rebels had managed to reach Florida gave the story of Stono a note of endurance amidst its tragedy. If true, their survival would not only have been physical but symbolic, proof that the human will to resist could overcome incredible odds. For those enslaved still working the fields in Carolina, such tales could offer quiet encouragement, a reminder that their condition, however harsh, was not immovable fate. Freedom, distant though it seemed, was still a dream worth chasing. The image of fugitives moving silently through the dense Carolina swamps lingers in the imagination. Perhaps they traveled by night, guided by the stars, avoiding settlements and roads, listening for the sounds of hounds that might have been unleashed in pursuit. Perhaps they found refuge among native communities or sympathetic individuals willing to aid their dangerous passage. And if they reached Florida, perhaps they were welcomed into communities of free black men and women who had themselves fled the plantations, forming a fragile but resilient society that lived on the margins of empire. In those small possibilities lies the power of their story. For rebellion is not measured only by victory or defeat in a single battle but by the hope it inspires in generations that follow. Meanwhile, the colonial government wasted no time in turning tragedy into policy. Within months, the Security Act was passed, requiring white men to carry firearms to church and in public, while the Negro Act of 1740 stripped enslaved people of whatever rights they had been allowed, including the ability to grow their own food, learn to read, or earn money. These measures reveal the deep fear that the rebellion had carved into the hearts of the colonial elite. Though the uprising had been suppressed, the thought of hundreds of enslaved workers rising together in unison haunted the planters' imagination. Every whispered conversation, every beat of a drum, every gathering in the fields became suspect, and the atmosphere of the South shifted into an even harsher system of control. For those who had participated, whether they perished, were captured, or disappeared into the unknown, their courage lived on. The Stono Rebellion became one of the largest and most consequential uprisings in the history of British North America, a reminder that slavery was not endured passively but constantly contested by the very people it sought to subjugate. Even in its suppression, The rebellion carved deep cracks into the illusion of planter invincibility, showing that human beings would not willingly surrender their dignity without a fight. The harsh reprisals that followed only underscored the fear colonial society held toward the enslaved population, proving that resistance was both inevitable and powerful enough to shake the foundations of the system. Centuries later, when we look back on that September morning, we remember more than just the gunfire and the loss. We remember the vision of men and women who believed in a life beyond bondage, who risked everything for the faint chance of reaching freedom. Some may have been crushed beneath the weight of the militia's might, but others, perhaps, crossed into Florida and breathed the air of liberty. However briefly, their footsteps still echo in history, not only as rebels against oppression but as symbols of resilience. And in the long shadow of Stono, we are reminded that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit can imagine a brighter horizon and move toward it, step by step, no matter the obstacles. As the dust settled and the echoes of defiance faded into the silence of repression, the world that enslaved people had known grew even darker. The rebellion, though a powerful cry for freedom, provoked a harsh and immediate response from the authorities, who feared that the spark of resistance could spread like wildfire. In the wake of this uprising came the Negro Act of 1740, a piece of legislation that sought not only to punish, but also to tighten the chains of control. This law stripped away what little autonomy enslaved men and women had managed to carve out for themselves. It forbade them from assembling without white supervision, making even the smallest gathering a crime. It banned literacy, silencing voices before they could learn to write their own stories. It restricted the ability to earn and manage money, ensuring that financial independence would remain forever out of reach. The intent was clear: to suffocate any possibility of rebellion at its root. Yet while the law strengthened the system of oppression, it also revealed the deep fear held by those in power. If the enslaved had not demonstrated courage, unity, and determination, such measures would never have been deemed necessary. In that, the uprising, though suppressed, was proof of the indomitable human spirit. It showed that even under unbearable chains, people still dreamed of freedom, still risked everything for the chance to live as more than property, still believed that the natural state of life was liberty. When we look back at this moment in history, we cannot help but feel the weight of its tragedy. Lives were lost, families torn apart, and communities fractured by violence and retribution. But we must also recognize the significance of what those rebels left behind: a legacy of resistance. They may not have toppled the institution of slavery, but they forced the world to see the strength of their will. Their struggle became part of a larger story, a thread in the tapestry of resistance that would eventually unravel the very system that sought to silence them. The Negro Act of 1740 remained in force for decades, casting a shadow over generations of enslaved people. Still, history teaches us that repression cannot fully extinguish the desire for freedom. Time and again, enslaved communities found ways to resist, to preserve their humanity, and to keep the flame alive. From whispered songs that carried coded messages, to clandestine schools hidden in barns, to daring escapes that carved paths to freedom, resistance took many forms. The story of this rebellion reminds us that every act of defiance, no matter how small, played a role in challenging the seemingly unshackable system of slavery. Today, as we reflect on these events, we are reminded of the courage it takes to stand against injustice. The rebels who fought, who fled, and who dreamed of liberty may not have seen the freedom they sought, but their sacrifice contributed to the long struggle that would one day end the horrors of slavery. Their voices, though silenced in their own time, echo across centuries, calling us to remember, to learn, and to honor the unyielding human quest for dignity. History is not merely a record of dates and laws, but a living narrative shaped by the choices of individuals who refuse to accept oppression as the final word. In telling these stories, we not only preserve memory but also draw strength for the present. The rebellion and its aftermath are more than chapters of the past. They are reminders of resilience, of the power of unity, and of the truth that freedom, though delayed, can never be denied forever. Thank you so much for joining me in revisiting this chapter of history. If you found this story meaningful, please take a moment to like this video. Share it with others who might also find value in learning about the past. And do not forget to subscribe to the channel for more narratives that uncover the human struggles and triumphs behind the pages of history. Every click of support helps this community grow and ensures that these voices from the past continue to be heard.